Welcome back, friends, to the shop. Today we're going to talk about some ways that maybe a guy can get through a Great Depression, if we have a Great Depression. How do I know how to get through a Great Depression? Well, I haven't personally been through one, but I grew up with my grandfather who was actually part of the original Okies, of course, the topic of the Steinbeck novel, The Grapes of Wrath, of all of the Midwest folks that could no longer make a living in the homestead, crossed the Rockies, oftentimes at great sacrifice, and settled into the West for the promise of jobs, most of them agricultural. So I remember his stories growing up with that. So knowing what I do about human nature and how things don't change all that much, how people reacted then and what they did is very similar to the way things would be today. Now, is there going to be a Great Depression like there was before? I don't know. I hope not. I hope things will kind of go back to the way they were. However, we got to look at some hard facts here. There's some jobs, a lot of jobs that people have that are going to be a long time coming back, if they come back at all. I mean, let me ask you this. Are you have any plans on getting on an airplane anytime soon? How many people are employed through Boeing and Airbus and the airports and all that? There are thousands and thousands of jobs that could be gone for a long time. Maybe it's months, maybe it's years. Many of those jobs, maybe they're never going to come back. That's just one example. Another one is, how about Disneyland and the service industry? I mean, are you going to actually go to a place like that with so many people confined in one area? Those are just a couple of examples, and there are thousands that I'm not even thinking of, these jobs that people are just not going to come to. I'm thinking the other day, I never thought before of going into my local bakery where they have, kind of a kiosk set up there with an iPad, and of course you swipe your name, and we all love how convenient that is. Now, are you going to want to be involved with one of those? Are you going to be want to touching that sort of thing? Well, maybe or maybe not, but the reality, whether or not there's any danger to it, the reality of it is people are afraid, and they're not going to like that. So how about the companies that manufacture that and the marketing teams and all that? So you see, it could go out and out and out to the point where who knows where the end is. So I don't know. People are still coming to grips with what's going on. People are not completely destitute yet, but it's a lot of these jobs just might not come back. And if you are very specific and you don't have anything that you can do or any training or to do something else, and if you're unwilling, that could be hard times. What's your solution? Might be moving back in with your folks, right? So we want to avoid that, right? So Granddad, of course, grew up in Oklahoma, and they were on a self-sufficient farm. So when the Depression came, he said at first, they weren't really even aware of anything that was going on. They read the newspapers and they heard the news of the stock market crashes and all these things that were going on, but it didn't really affect the folks in the country for some time, But eventually, it ended up catching up with them. Well, they got to the point where they could no longer sustain themselves there, and the whole family, we're talking big families living together, loaded up all their possessions, everything that they had, tools and stuff that they could carry, sold all the rest, and headed in 3 vehicles, a Model A and a Model T pickup, 2 vehicles, I think, 2 or 3, maybe a couple of Model A's, up over the Rockies. And Granddad told me that their trucks were so loaded down that the boys actually had to get out and push. The cars and the trucks didn't have enough power. They were so overloaded with all their possessions. So what do we take from that, right? So if you live in a city, let's say take New York City, for example, or any of the bigger cities. Now, even before this whole Corona thing came on, these cities were in decline. People were just getting fed up with having roommates and spending $2,000, $3,000 for a 350 square foot hole in the wall and cockroach-infested dump. And the expense to live there oftentimes outstripped the benefit that you might receive from any higher wages. And people were kind of just getting finished up with it, especially young people. So there was already an exodus out of these cities before this happened. What do you think is going to happen now? Or fast forward 60, 90 days when if it really gets bad, the economy really tanks, those cities are going to be rough. And if there's no work, there's going to be an exodus from those cities. So, kind of having an idea, I'm not fear-mongering here, but I don't want you to be caught flat-footed. If you're in that situation, you might want to think about moving. The folks in the Midwest, when they could no longer make it a living, they moved to where the work was. So you need to take a hard look at that. What can you do? What are your abilities? Maybe even an option would be to move back to the home that you grew up in, maybe to have the support of your family and such. So you need to be maybe taking those steps right now. If you are unsure if your job is going to be here, then I would start downsizing. I'd start getting rid of some things and making that move, ultimately planning. I don't have to, but if I do have to go, I can go quickly and I can go where the work is. So keep an ear to the ground. What industries are thriving? What industries are doing well? If you see something or you can predict something that's going to be doing well in the future, maybe start thinking about getting some training in on that. Jump in now before everyone else figures it out, right? So you need to be willing to do that. One thing that was really common, people were tougher, I think. Well, I don't know about tougher. They were more accustomed to hardship. Let me put it that way. It's an interesting fact that what do you think the most common tool was? Let's say you were a single man, you were a bachelor, and you had no prospects, you lost your job in town, you heard there's work in California, and you need to go there. How are you going to get there, right? Well, a lot of them started walking. Started walking with what they had on their back and would hitch rides or maybe jump on a train or do what they had to do to get out west to where the work was. So these men, these thought to themselves, if I could only take one tool with me to make a living, to pick up some side work, do whatever I have to do, what would that be? What do you think it was? It was a garden hoe. These guys, by and large, took garden hoes because they thought, well, I could stop and I could get a little extra money doing a patch of weeds and planting some potatoes. That's what they took, right? So make sure that you think about that. Be willing to bring yourself down a little bit and maybe into a job that is maybe not as prestigious as what you were accustomed to. But we're not used to going down, right? We should be going up. We should be increasing our status and increasing our income, but that may not be the case because it's better to pick apples than it is to starve and to beg for food. I think most of us would agree. So I think that's important. The other thing that Granddad told me that they really learned is once they finally got across the Rockies and down the western slope, and ultimately they settled in Sun Valley, Idaho. Whole family, men, women, children, the whole deal. The only thing that they could really do is to stay in tents that they'd bought. So they'd bought some canvas wall tents, the same type that I've talked about, in our elk hunting camps, and they lived in there for many years. And the men needed work; they didn't, have anything going on, so they did a couple things. There were jobs at the ski lodge. So I know Granddad worked there in the evening time, and he would wash dishes and do janitorial work and such, while the women stayed at home in Sun Valley with the kids and making homes in those tents, right? Well, the men also, in addition, one job of course wasn't enough. Times were really tough and they had to look after their family. They went to work in the woods and they did light hand logging, crosscut saws, axes, firewood, lumber, dimensional lumber, that sort of thing. My granddad's, his dad, my great granddad, actually took one of the Model Ts and turned it into a sawmill. So they would jack it up and took one of the wheels off and they made a big leather belt that built a sawmill, and they started cutting timber to make a living. And they were reestablishing themselves. He said it was really something for a Midwest man that had never seen anything but just the prairies and fields of Oklahoma to come up over the Rockies and to see all that country and to settle into this place on the Pacific Northwest with these giant conifers, these giant firs and Doug firs and pine trees. It was just unbelievable. And to see snow and in the mountains and all that, just incredible. But what that comes back to is what we learned from that was the importance of family. The men were able to go out and to make a living with multiple jobs in the logging, while the women stayed home and canned and saved money the best they could and took care of the family. So it's tougher. I got a motorcycle, go by. It's tougher if you're all on your own than it would have been to have your family around for you. Can you imagine trying to do all that and work all day in the woods and come home to a cold tent? It's much tougher rather than having your family around. So you might want to think that's what brought families together back then. You might want to consider that as well. Can you do something with your folks? Can you maybe have a brother or sister where you can combine some money, maybe sell some real estates that you have in the cities, buy something where you could build 2 or 3 lots where it'd be semi-private, just some ideas, things to think about that that you maybe haven't. The other thing that really came out of the third and really the final thing we'll talk about is the frugality that those people learned from going through that experience of what it was like to go. I don't know what it was like to go without, to not have the things that you just want. I mean, really today, within reason, most of us can have what we want or what we need. If we need food, or we need nails for this, or we need to buy a couple 2x4s or a spare tire for our car, usually we can get these things. It's not a problem. They're not too far out. Well, back then, these things may have been available, but you had no money. There was zero money to spare. No safety nets, nothing. So you had to make do with what you had, right? And that made a tremendous impression upon my granddad, I know. Just a couple examples that I've spoke to before. I grew up in a real tight-knit church organization, and when someone needed a roof, all of the men, the women, potluck, the whole deal would go over there and do it. And I remember the old guys would go and help and cut boards, and the young guys would pack stuff. It was really a good experience. But I remember our granddad would go around there after the guys had stripped off the old roofing. He would go around there and he would gather up the nails. He would take them home and he would straighten them and put them in a tin. He would save them and put them up in his attic. He saved everything up in his attic. And it was funny to go up there. It looked like an auto parts store. Him being a mechanic. Of course, whenever you work on stuff, there's always extra parts and clutch plates and different bearings and things. He'd save all that stuff. And what he didn't save, after work, he would take it all apart. He would separate the copper from the brass to the steel, and he would save it for a whole year. And once a year, him and I would take it to a guy, Zeusman, up in Portland, and we would sell it for scrap. And he would even go so far as to take the scrap wires. He had some friends that were electricians one of the few electricians who would actually clean up after themselves, would bring him the little cutoffs and things, and he'd throw them in the fire and burn all that insulation off there and meticulously clean all that stuff, so we got the #1 copper price. Those are the type of things that he did. When he changed oil on a vehicle, usually 5 or 6 quarts to change oil on your truck, and there's always a little bit left over. He would take those cans. This was back when they were cardboard, but he built a little holder, and he would let that drain all night. He'd get every last bit of that oil out of those cans, and ultimately, after maybe a couple hundred oil changes, he'd have 5 quarts to change. I often wondered if the dust and dirt and grime that accumulated in that open container he had offset the benefit that he may have received from getting a free 5 quarts. But I guess we'll never know. But that's the type of thing that he did. So we need to be willing to do that. We need to be willing to make do with not just going out and ordering everything off of Amazon and having it exactly the way you want. So it's amazing, even now, today, some of the things just 60 days ago, 30 days ago, that I would have in the past just despised and discarded as irrelevant into the trash or into the junk pile, I'm out there now digging through that, organizing it, setting aside, because who knows? Who knows what could happen? And you might need to rely upon that. Same thing that goes for food. If you have it in your means now to buy some food and to get into canning and to put some things away, even clothing, those sorts of things, a person might want to do it. Clothing was a big problem back in those days. I think about the song my grandmother used to sing to me, the Coat of Many Colors, Dolly Parton song, about how poor that family was during the Depression, that they had, only thing that they could do was to take some rags and sew little pieces and ultimately make them into coats and clothing for their children. That's poor. Granddad said when they left Oklahoma, he said he remembered passing a guy on the road that was in front of him sitting in a Model T. He'd kicked out the front windshield. He had 2 horses that were hooked up to this thing, and he had the reins running through the window, and he was heading west to California for the hope of jobs and work. So, incredible. If we don't know our history and we don't maintain these things and we don't pass these things on to our kids and family, we really are unprepared. We're not preparing them for troubles that they could face. If you're 20 or 30 years old and you think that life is always going to be the way that it always has been, even me at 50, even me, I still have to, it's hard to get my head around that, to think that it might not just always just be perfect and getting better all the time. It's hard to deal with, right? But we don't want to be foolish, because we'd be foolish if we didn't look at our history and if we didn't take heed of the stories that we heard from our grandfathers and learn and make sure that we listen to that and prep our own families. So those are just some things that I was thinking about today. So I hope that helps. If you have any questions or comments, I'll be in the comment section. So please keep us in your prayers. May God bless you and your families, and we'll see you guys on the next video.